Today's webinar is made possible by a grant from the Foundation for Evangelism, where we've been in mission and ministry for over 70 years, trying to serve as a catalyst to equip disciples to share the good news of Jesus Christ. And we do that in three ways primarily: raising up gospel leaders, equipping the local church, and engaging the ministry of the laity. Encourage you, if you haven't checked out our website, we have some great resources there available for local churches, and would love for you to take a look at that, as well as see some of our past webinars and other studies that we have available to you. And tonight, I am thrilled to have this first of two sessions that we'll be doing. My name is Heather Lear. I have the privilege of serving as the Research and Teaching Fellow at the Foundation for Evangelism. And I am really thrilled to be joined tonight by the Reverend Dr. Priscilla Pope-Levison, who, as you can see there, her official title is serving as Associate Dean and Professor of Ministerial Studies at the Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. But what I love about Priscilla is that she's worn lots of different hats, taught lots of different courses, but has always had a heart and a passion for evangelism. And I'm so glad that you were able to continue to explore that through your latest book, Models of Evangelism, which I encourage everybody to go out and get a copy of if you haven't already. And just know that all of us will be blessed today by what she has to share, and just give thanks to God, Priscilla, for you and for your work and for this time and your graciousness in joining us tonight. And so with that, I'm not going to do any more talking. I want to leave the time open and available for you to share, because I know you have a lot of good information to share with us. So thank you and welcome.
All right. Well, thank you, Heather, and welcome to everybody. It's so strange not to be able to see anyone, but I trust there are people out there. Yes, there look like to be 21 of you. So otherwise, I feel like I'm speaking into a void, or just to Heather, which is great. So we can have a conversation. I want to begin by thanking the Foundation for Evangelism for inviting me to do this webinar. It's been a long time since I've been officially associated with the Foundation. I was the first evangelism professor at Duke Divinity School a long time ago, probably before some of you were born, 1994 to 2001. And I appreciate so much being considered a part of the family, I guess we'll put it like that. And to be able to do this webinar tonight. And I'm calling it Reframing the E Word. So I'm going to do some about the book, but I'm hoping to put it in a larger context about how do we reframe and live into evangelism. And so we'll see what you think. By the way, this is my website. And as I was saying to on a presentation today, it's primarily, it's my attempt as a teacher and researcher to provide information, particularly on women evangelists. So there are a lot of vignettes of women evangelists, which has been the focus of my historical research. And then there are some articles that you can download. So it's my attempt to provide to the public some of the resources that I had to scour in archives from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, all the way to Los Angeles. So I'm saving you all that travel time, which you can't do right now anyway, and giving you some stories of women evangelists. So I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes. I'm going to stop about halfway through and ask you a question that I'm going to stop share then, and maybe we can have a conversation. And then I think there'll be about a half an hour or so for a conversation. I want to do a shout out to Mark Teasdale's students. I know you're here mostly to gain your extra credit, and don't worry, I did that many times as a professor. But I'm so delighted you're here. We had the privilege of hosting Mark at Perkins a couple of years ago, and I had students read his book, and it was just wonderful. So, okay, so let's move into the presentation. So, E-word. So some people feel like evangelism is for idiots, right? And that's due a lot to the negative caricatures that we have. And I sometimes don't know whether most of us have actually experienced that, or it's just kind of in the woodwork. It's part of the lore of the culture that there are these people. But I imagine that most of us have probably had best Sunday dressed visitors show up at our door with religious literature. And once I wrote the Visitation chapter in this book, I have a lot of respect for their zeal. But it's especially hard, it's especially hard when you're like outside cutting the grass or in the garden and you can't escape. So you take their literature and mumble. Sometimes I'll say, I am a pastor, and that's not the good thing to say, because then you'll get into a theological discussion. Another caricature, of course, is those who stand on the street corner and spout out, if you died tonight, where would you spend eternity, or have this literature or whatever out, and it's you don't know what to do, so you kind of subconsciously avert your gaze and move on by. None of this was helped by the exploits of some leading televangelists in the 1980s. For those of us who remember Tammy and Jim Baker, who fell from grace, forfeiting their vast financial empire, which even included a theme park. Or Jimmy Swaggart, of course, who engaged in sexual exploits and wept on television. And these kind of financial and sexual shenanigans only reinforced, even for many Christians, and certainly for people who would not consider themselves Christians, that evangelism was not something that they wanted to take advantage of. More recently, there's been a lot of money spent on airplanes by televangelists like Kenneth Copeland, who was exposed for owning at least 3 private aircraft, including a $20 million Citation 10 and a Gulfstream V jet. This I'm in Texas, but Texas-based preacher suggested that he would be surrounded by demonic forces if he flew on a commercial airline. Another evangelist, Jesse Duplantis, told his followers that if Jesus were to descend from heaven and physically set forth on 21st century Earth, the Redeemer would probably take a pass on riding on the back of a donkey. He said he'd be on an airplane preaching the gospel all over the world. And Duplantis asked his followers to pay for a $54 million plane, even though he already owned 3. So, caricatures of people who annoy us showing up at the door, or accost us on the streets, or who have made what I would consider poor choices of financial largesse and so forth. So with all this negative press, why did I write a book on evangelism? That's a very good question. For me, evangelism is part of the DNA of who is a Christian, what makes a Christian. It's just part of who we are. And I want to remind us as we get further into this of what evangelism means. The Greek simply means good news, glad tidings, or the gospel. Just like we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, the Gospels, the good news of Jesus Christ. Evangelism, euangelion in Greek, is good news. And therefore, whoever is an evangelist is one who proclaims good news. And I love this. In classical Greek, it referred to one who brings a message of victory or other political or personal news that brings joy. I think in all of this negativity and all of these not forthright caricatures, in a way, we've lost the sense that at its root, evangelism is bringing joy. And if we believe that Jesus Christ is the source of new life here and for eternity, that's a joyful bit of news to share. And I don't have it with me, but there's a wonderful definition by Pope Francis that uses this word joy when he talks about what evangelism is, that inviting people to a banquet and where they can experience joy. So I think it's helpful always to get back to what the root of a word means, and that is evangelism. So I wrote a book that came out of 20 plus years of teaching evangelism. I always had my students, and I had a much longer list than what's in here, choose a model of evangelism and do research, look at the biblical, theological, historical, and practical foundations of this model. And I found that students really appreciated something like a stake in the ground. You know, we talk, and particularly us professors, we talk a lot kind of up here. And what they appreciated was to have a toehold on how they could do evangelism. And then my final project for them was to take 2 or 3 models and design a year-long evangelistic strategy that utilized these models. And in this book, these models vary dramatically, which is another way for me to say that there's not one size fits all in how to do evangelism, who is an evangelist. It's a wide range fitting all kinds of personalities and approaches. So you think here about the difference between personal evangelism, one-on-one evangelism, often among friends, compared to a revival, which is a highly orchestrated event. Just the difference of that is something to think about, and yet this is all evangelism. Or you think about the difference between a media evangelism, which today is often being done over the internet, compared to liturgical evangelism, which grounds worship and pedagogy and catechesis in the advance of the church year. So you've got these very different models, all of which comprise ways to do evangelism. So I wanted to present a wide spectrum with the hope that each person could find his or her place, each church, maybe in a model or a combination of models. So let me tell you just very briefly about the models that I've done. So one is personal, which, as I said, is developing and taking advantage of a one-on-one relationship with someone who would not consider themselves a Christian. And in the context of that relationship, sharing the gospel. Personal evangelism, however, can also happen with someone you meet on the street or on the plane. I mean, my book doesn't, but most books of evangelism begin with the evangelist who's had this amazing experience. You know, all they want to do when they sit down on the plane is hide in their book. And then, of course, someone who's just primed for the gospel sits down next to them, and there's this wonderful, success story. And maybe because I don't have that, but I also think it's a little cliche. So my book doesn't begin that way. Okay, small group. To be honest, I think this is the most underrated model of evangelism. And if nothing else, please consider this model for evangelism. It is exactly what it says. It's a small group designed specifically for evangelism. So this is a short stint for a small group, 4, 5, 6 weeks, 8 to 12 people that you've invited. You've been completely honest about what the small group, we know we're not trying to be covert in this. You explain exactly what it is, and if they want to sign up, wonderful. My friend Judy Zink is on this webinar. InterVarsity has done amazing things with small group evangelism, and a great book published by InterVarsity is Richard Peace's Small Group Evangelism. This has the benefit of having people together in a small community. Generally, there are 2 leaders, Christians who are leading this group, so you're not alone. I just highly recommend that you consider this. If the whole idea of evangelism scares you, then consider joining with a partner and launching a small group. It's a short-term commitment, and just, pray and see what happens. You can read more about that in the book. Okay, so I mentioned Visitation, and I have to admit that I had some real yikes, what is this going to be about? But I came across a book by another evangelism professor who taught for many years at Princeton, Richard Armstrong. And he has this great little book called The Oak Lane Story. And it's about his work in a Presbyterian inner city church in the 60s, where the church became completely different from the socioeconomic and ethnic neighbors who had come into the neighborhood. And rather than shutting down or closing themselves off, they decided to open their doors and did a visitation evangelism with a service component. And that's what I have worked on in this chapter of calling the church to go outside the walls to its neighbors and, who are you? What are your needs? And how can we serve you? And so visitation with a twist. Liturgical. This is a very scripted, I should say, approach to evangelism that follows the church year, has ancient roots back to the early church. But I love this idea of, as I said before, of combining worship and catechesis and evangelism into the church year, beginning with Advent and then moving eventually through Lent and time of confession, and then Easter Sunday. And what it recognizes is that a lot of people don't come to Christ right in a moment. It takes them a while, and they want to learn what is it that I'm saying yes to. And I think that this is a lovely view of evangelism, or model of evangelism. Church growth. It has a lot of negative press. I happen to think there's a lot of good in church growth. For instance, one of my favorite ideas, which I think churches, all of us could benefit from, is developing new ports of entry. We all know that Sunday school classes plateau, churches plateau, and until we recognize that newcomers don't want to come into an established group. It wasn't until I got to Texas that I realized that, first of all, not every Sunday school class that's been around for a while has a name. Most of them started when they were young professionals or young kids or whatever, and they've grown older together, and they will identify more with their Sunday school class than their church. So, here we are, newcomers. And they're wonderfully welcoming. Please come to our Sunday school class. But the reality is they all know each other. They know each other's kids. If they have kids, they know each other's professions and all of that. And they have a history together, which is wonderful, but it makes it hard for newcomers to join. There's a lot more to be said about church growth, but I think that's one idea that many churches can implement. Who is it that you have a bridge person to who you could start a new group around? Okay, this is taking me longer. Sorry, I get excited. Prophetic. Prophetic is challenging because it is looking at the structures of society and incorporating structural conversion into evangelism. What I think is its strongest component is the integration of word and deed. And that these two components of the gospel that we preach and the gospel that we work towards and seeking to bring God's reign more fully on earth, that's all part of evangelism. I lift up people like John Perkins, who I think is an incredible example of prophetic evangelism. And he talks about the whole gospel, that there's not a social gospel and a spiritual gospel, but these are all one. And I think he is a prophet, to be honest, for our day. Okay, revival. I mentioned also before, it's a highly orchestrated event with music and often drama and a charismatic speaker. And where I think the local church, I know revival is not practiced a lot, particularly in mainline Protestantism, where I think the local church could really, what should I say, come alongside the revivals. I was just speaking about Dwight Moody earlier today, and Moody, when he came to a city, he made sure that the churches were on board with it, so that when someone did respond to the gospel, they had somewhere to go. And I think there is that safety net in a way that churches can provide for revivals. Lastly, I look at media, and by media, I'm talking about tools of communication. So that could be the written word. Of course, that could be radio, television, movies, internet. This one was hard for me to write because I'm not really a social media person. But that's not the only kind of media to use in evangelism. But I had a lot of help with this. I had people who are much savvier than I am in this, and I actually had a lot of fun writing that chapter. Okay, so I'm going to stop for just a minute, and I'm going to stop share with the hope that I can come back to it. And Jason, is there any way to get everybody up on the screen? Because I'd love to hear if even from 3 or 4 people, if you've had experience with any of these models, either negative or positive, that you think would be fun to share just very briefly.
Yeah, so Priscilla, I'll just say our attendees are not on webcam tonight, but they could certainly submit their stuff in the chat window or via the Q&A.
Okay, so if you've had an experience with any of these models that you want to just say, yay, media evangelism, or no way, or I'd love to hear just any responses before I go further.
Priscilla, I think it would also be interesting to see if anybody has used any of the models together.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to put it in the chat, that would be great. And yes to small groups. Mm-hmm. Is that my friend Jane? If that's Jane, we're in a Lectio group together. We have been for 7 years, and that's a good example. You know, we have an incredibly lovely group, but again, we know each other so well that it would be hard for anyone else to join us, even though we would welcome it. Okay, prophetic is always intellectually challenging, but the transformation into action is the challenge. That's incredible. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate your saying that. It is absolutely. Barbie, hi. Personal evangelism. Oh, I'm glad it's your comfort zone. It's not for many people. And I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name right, Cerna or Cherna. Personal and visitation. If that's Lisa Hancock, my friend, I love the small groups too, but it's hard to break into one. And that's the beauty of this, is that it's short term, and the point is then to multiply the groups, so that if there are some who have really gotten excited about the gospel, then you tap them into leadership. And so it's kind of exponential. Judy Zink, I mentioned, who's worked with InterVarsity. I've seen powerful evangelism through Christian music festivals, which are like a revival. Yes, absolutely. Small group. Okay, well, I'm glad that the small group is good. I've had both good and bad experiences with receiving visitors, and I'd love to hear more about that. Okay, I'm going to continue. And hopefully we will have some time to talk after this. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. All right. Okay, so this is the bulk of the book, are these 8 models. And as I said, I look at them biblically, theologically, historically, and practically. And we can talk more about how to use the book and so forth. But I know that models can also be off-putting. And so what I did in the book's conclusion is really where I want to spend the rest of the time of this presentation, is I looked, so in a sense, the model can stand on their own, but then I went back and looked through all 8 models and sort of cross-referenced them and said, what are attributes that are inherent in all of the models? And this is really where I want to emphasize tonight, that more than a model, I believe that evangelism is really a lifestyle. And there is a model called lifestyle evangelism that that I think that if we could incorporate the 5 attributes that I'm going to present here tonight, I think we will be evangelists, because there's not, to practice these is to do evangelism. So again, I don't want you to get caught up in which model. It's maybe if you're nervous or afraid, think about incorporating these attributes in your lifestyle. And they're ones that are very, very well known: hospitality, relationships, integrity, message bearing, and church rootedness. And I'm going to talk briefly about each one. I can't emphasize enough hospitality. I have been in so many churches where I've walked in and walked out and never a space made, in a sense, not a greeting. And this has happened to me all over the country. It's not just the frozen chosen or whatever, the nuns in Pacific Northwest. It happens everywhere. And I think this is maybe a place for all of us to look carefully at ourselves. And is this who we are? Is this who our churches are? I love this definition by Henry Nouwen, defining hospitality as the offer of a space where change can take place, a space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. And what Nouwen is tapping into is the root definition of the word hospitality, which in Greek is philoxenos. Phileo is the verb to love. Xenos is stranger, where we get the word xenophobia. And hospitality is love of the stranger. Let that soak in. Who is the stranger? I mean, that can be so many different possibilities of who is the stranger. One of the richest biblical stories about hospitality is found in the story of Abraham and Sarah, who greet the 3 strangers who come to their tent where they are by the oaks of Mamre. And in that story, there are these attributes of hospitality. And again, as I mentioned them, think about your own life, think about your church's life. First of all, there was a welcome. You know, Abraham leaves his tent and goes out to greet the strangers. There is a gesture of honor to show them that they are welcome. Abraham and Sarah spend time with the guests. They prepare food especially for them. They provide rest in the shade. They give the strangers and their animals shelter, and they leave them with a blessing. Amazing characteristics of what it is to be hospitable. Okay, we're going to move on, but this is the one that I most resonate with. Okay, relationships. It is true that a relationship with a Christian is the #1 reason cited by people as motivating their gravitating to Christianity. And, you know, I write a book on it. Televangelists spend gobs of money, revivals, all of that. But the #1 reason, and you see here that I have actually seen 90%, is because of a relationship with a Christian. And Barbie, I'm glad you said personal evangelism is your comfort zone, because this is really where it is developing these relationships with people. And I want to say that I think it's even more important now than it used to be. You know, revival used to be much more prevalent, where people, you know, made a decision in a moment. That time is really going, or has left, in a sense. And this is now relationships for the long haul. And it may take months, years, but that relationship is so critical to evangelism. Okay, integrity. This is another one that I want to spend a little bit of time on, because so often people are turned off by Christianity, by the church, because we're hypocritical. and you can, and it's not even just like the things that make their way into the news, but it's, it's us as individuals who say one thing and do another. And yet, this recent poll, which of any of the following would make you more interested in listening to what Christians had to say? It's all about the integration of word and deed. I saw them treat others better because of their faith. I saw them caring for people's needs. I saw them standing up against injustice, and I saw them using their faith to solve problems in our community. Again, this is where prophetic evangelism is so strong, because there is this integration of word and deed. Integrity, Jack, my spouse, quoted often to our kids, learned it from his dad, that basically being a person of integrity is the one thing that you can control. So I want to highly recommend this as an attribute. Message bearing. There will come a time in the relationship, in the midst of hospitality, where there will come a time to talk about the gospel. No matter whether we start with questions or however, there will be a time to be a message bearer. And this is wonderfully biblical. This is, to be honest, this is my go-to scripture for evangelism. I just love this text because, first of all, it's very embodied. You have voice, you have feet, and you have, getting back to, this is from the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, you have the repetition of euangelizomai. The verb comes from euangelion. You have this repeated twice, announcing peace, shalom, bringing good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God's reign. So in this one text, there are 3 different ways that talk about being a message bearer: announcing peace, bringing good news, announcing salvation. And this was such a pivotal text that it shows up in the Apostle Paul's writing in Romans, where he quotes this when he's talking about the task of proclamation. How are they going to, if they haven't heard, and how are they going to hear without someone to proclaim? And he quotes Isaiah 52:7, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And so it's pretty inescapable. And I hope you'll live into this moment, or these moments, where it is appropriate for you to talk about your faith, your testimony, to talk, to do gospel talk. I'm excited. A colleague and I wrote a grant that we received funding from the Lilly Endowment to work on testimony. And I think it's a lost art, but where is God interacting with your story? And where is God active in the world? And how do we tell stories that invite other people into God's work in the world? I think, I've seen in COVID, so many churches going online, incorporating a time of testimony. It happened at our church, where a nurse in a COVID unit talked about being the feet and hands of God. And it was just incredibly moving. I need to keep moving on. Okay, the same thing we see in Jesus. Of course, Mark is, most scholars think, is the earliest gospel. And here you have Jesus being a message bearer of the good news of God's reign. Finally, church rootedness. All of these models are dependent on the church, some more than others, but having a church in which is praying, which is welcoming, which is ready to come alongside, is such an important attribute of evangelism. And this has been true of another E. Stanley Jones professor, Brian Stone, did this study, Finding Faith Today, and named the church as the key inspiration. Now I've said already that people can look at the church and call it hypocritical, but the reality is that a church community has been fundamental in helping people in a sense, come to Christ. And oh, I thought there was one more thing that I wanted to say there. So, so these respondents note the influence of their decision of the church community. So I think that's what I wanted to say to you tonight. So I'm going to stop share, and I think, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go quite so long, but we still have about 20 minutes. I'd love to answer your questions, or you know, have a dialogue with you via chat. So what's percolating in your mind in what I presented, or anything else related to evangelism? We've got a lot of expertise here with Heather and Mark and others on this call. And Wesley D'Souza is here too. So we've got lots and lots of expertise.
And Priscilla, if I could just ask a question, because this is something that we do talk about in our webinars, but love to get your take on it. With the important role of congregations, a lot of congregations need to have a significant culture change to engage in this work. You mentioned starting to incorporate testimony and some faith sharing. What are ways that you would recommend, I guess, as starting points for congregations to begin, if there has been the hesitancy? Let's say they get past all the negative baggage and this is something we want to do, we're just not sure how or how to start.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that you and Mark have a lot of, you know, good things going there. I do think that spending time, you know, sort of looking at the negative is important. But I think one way to maybe get over that hump is to find someone in the community who is doing this. And I would imagine that in most churches there's someone for whom this comes quite naturally. And I think that one way is, you know, we all look to people we respect, or want to learn from people that we know already and have, you know, a good feeling about, so to speak. And I think lifting up to begin with what the church is already doing. So there is this negativity, but what is the church doing, even modestly, that they could build on? So maybe absolutely a culture shift, but we all have to start with what's there. So what is there someone, or is there someone they've come across in the community that could be brought in as almost as a resource person? I think beginning where they are would be a good way to help them get over the hump.
Thanks. Again, we'd love to gather your questions, or even if you'd like to pick Priscilla's brain a little bit,
well,
that would be great as well too.
So Matt, I'm glad you got the link, and he's saying my experience has been that some mainline Protestants have all but abandoned evangelism. And you're absolutely right, that they have all but almost abandoned evangelism. I think the work of the foundation has been so important because they're getting to those who are training for the ministry, and working, you know, planting, having the evangelism professors in a seminary, so that is beginning even before the students have graduated. I'm not ready to give up on evangelism yet, obviously. I would say that it's not just mainline Protestantism, though. I think a lot of Christians, even if you want to say more conservative Christians, have given up on evangelism. But I'm not pessimistic yet. Other responses. It doesn't even have to be a question, or what are you thinking? I'd love to hear. I can't see you, so the only way for me to know what you're thinking is to have you go into the chat. What about some of Mark's students? Would you comment on the effectiveness on media presentations of the gospel? Interesting. Okay, now Judy, I have not been watching The Chosen. So let's do some dialogue. Are others of you, what do you think of The Chosen if you've been watching it? Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it. Any thoughts on, okay, so Michael Wilkerson's saying, I like it. Would it be, so if you started a small group for evangelism, are there some clips or some I guess even an entire program that kind of to make so Judy, you're saying it makes Jesus so relatable. Would that be a bridge with people who have yet to make a commitment to Christ? Possibly, maybe. I wish I had watched it, but I appreciate it. So Judy, your question, I think that media presentations can be really effective. And again, it can be something that's integrated into a small group setting, maybe into a worship setting or some way to get the conversation going. Okay. So there's a question about how might we help people who came to faith in a different way, in a different era, tell a story that is good news for people who are secular today. I'd love to ask you a little bit more what you mean by that. I guess what I would say is that that people's stories are important. They're how faith became real to them. So it may have been different. I mean, certainly my story, I was raised in the church. That is fairly unique these days in a way. But I think that my story has resonance because it is integral to my faith journey. And so I don't think there's such a disconnect, but I would love to talk with you more. Okay, can I speak a little bit about radical hospitality in this pluralistic world? This is where I think that that those attributes that I talked about really do come to the fore. Building relationship, hospitality that is well, I'd love to talk with you more about what you would imagine is radical hospitality, but I think about a person like Leslie Newbegin, who was a tremendous Christian leader, missionary, ecumenist, and he really encouraged Christians, even in a pluralistic world, especially in a pluralistic world, to be honest and forthright about their beliefs and invite others to be honest and forthright about their beliefs. So rather than trying to find a common denominator, or kind of trying to pare everything down to something that is universal, he took a very opposite, a very different approach. That we not hide or we not be hesitant about our faith, and then our partner in dialogue, in a sense, do the same. And he felt that only in that kind of radically honest, if you want to say, space would there be true conversation and true understanding of who we are. And he believed that that's where we all would meet Jesus, so to speak. Okay, let's see. I belong to a relatively well-off white congregation in a community with marked racial and economic diversity. All seem pretty happy, but how do we connect sharing the good news with each other in the world we live in? Oh gosh, this is so hard not to talk to you all about this. So Jim, I guess my question to you is, can you connect with these other congregations in shared work together, or for the community or something? So it can start with, in a sense, work together projects. But how do we connect sharing the good news with each other in the world we live in? So I'm assuming that there are churches in the community as well. How cool would that be if all the churches joined together, in a sense, and did a joint project for the community? Maybe even did a joint visitation project or program. But I don't feel like I'm giving you a very good answer in that. How effective is your simple day-to-day lifestyle for initiating an opportunity to share the gospel? Michael, I think it's incredibly effective, especially if we are in prayer about it, especially if we are asking the Spirit to open our eyes, to open our ears, to help us be aware of opportunities. I think I think about someone. One of my favorite evangelists in the Bible is Philip, and I think about the Spirit bringing Philip to a wilderness road, and who would have thought that just happened along the way was the Ethiopian eunuch and all of that wonderful conversation. I'm not sure that experience will be that, what should I say, that we'll meet someone on a wilderness road, but I do believe that there are opportunities that if we're looking through the eyes of faith, in a sense, and have put ourselves in that space where we're open to conversations, that we'll have the opportunity to share the message. And it often starts, the Philip came to the Ethiopian eunuch, and the first thing he did was to ask a question. And so I think that's really helps us be attentive to the person and their situation, their context, and the conversation can go from there. So, all right, Barbie, been a part of a few small church revivals that really brought in members of the church. I love the idea of concert festivals being a type of revival. Barbie, I want to suggest too, this is an idea that I took from Ron Sider, who's another, I think, really important voice for Christian. He just has this holistic approach, and he talks about the shalom revivals. And what he's suggesting with that is not only what you're, I think, referring to as the old-fashioned revival, kind of, come to Jesus, but also calling already Christians, established Christians, to work for social justice. He names like working for the environment, or for, inner city neighborhoods or whatever. And I like that because it kind of puts us all in a similar boat, in a sense. So it's not just calling those who to come forward for conversion, but calling all of us to recognize that we have a role to play. We have that God is calling us to greater faithfulness and greater work for transformation. And I just really like that idea of maybe a twist, a tweak on revivals to give them a holistic approach, and get all of us up on our feet, so to speak. Okay, I am tired of hearing myself talk. Heather, I'm sure you have things that you want to say. I'd love to have you answer some of these questions.
Well, you've done a fabulous job. The only thing I could think of when relating to Jim's question, relatively well-off white congregation, I've served a couple churches like that, and what I've found kind of the struggle is making the connection between being a nice, good person and doing things for other people, because that's what we should do. A lot of times there's a breakdown in connecting that to our faith, and the motivation of why we're doing that. So I'm really excited about your project around testimony, because I think so much of this work needs to happen internally, that folks just, we haven't practiced telling our story or naming how God has been active in our lives. And so it's hard for us to share with other people, because we're not even doing that within our own church families.
Right.
So I think that's a huge place to start before we even look externally. How can we help our folks internally to be more comfortable, and to make those connections between our discipleship and our work, kind of the word and deed. I think there's a lot of work we can do there. And I think what I love about those qualities that you raised after the models is that something we can look at our existing ministries and see how is our children's ministry, how are our worship services practicing hospitality, how are we helping people to build relationships, all of those different pieces. We can again take those things we're already doing and kind of use that as our checklist and our ways of kind of evaluating and seeing where we might have areas for growth.
So this right now, so I'm putting together this grant right now, and the first, I'm imagining it sort of in three parts. The first part will be what I'm calling testimony formation, and some of that will just be some very basic spiritual formation practices, contemplative practices, Lectio Divina and things, and just building that spiritual depth. So let me just take a little aside. As some of you know, Jack and I are going to be moving into an SMU dorm on July 1st to live with 180 undergraduates. Yes, at our age, it's crazy, but what else can we do? And I'm already feeling sort of, I don't want to say darkness, but I can tell. I mean, we are moving into a heart of ministry that we haven't been in for a long time. I mean, you have a ministry teaching, but we're going to be living with all kinds of students, and so it's just building up that spiritual depth, and then working on testimony articulation. And Heather, that will be within the church community, and because I think that's a way to start practicing in a way, and hearing those we worship next to, hearing their stories, where are they encountering God, and how encouraging that could be, how challenging in a way, but then helping the testimony in action of then spilling out that testimony into the community. But I think you're right. I think it begins within ourselves, within our community. And I'm hoping, my prayer is that churches who go through this will be built up as a community of believers who then are fortified in a sense. I mean, that's my hope. That's our dream. So I love Mike Breen's chapter on our personal gospel. Great. I don't know that book, Matthew, and I appreciate your sharing that. Gosh, I've read so much, and I still think there's so much to read.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
okay. Phew.
Well, and I was going to say, I think doing that work internally, then, and shoring up some of that discipleship, then provides a place for people to go and connect if they do say yes and they want to learn more.
Yes.
Because that's the other thing, if we go about these models and these activities, what if people want to learn more? Do we know what to do with them? Are we ready?
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
So we're going to be opening, if any of your churches are within a 250-mile radius of Dallas, we're going to be opening applications soon for our first cohort of 10 churches. So if I talk to you in a year, I may be elated, I may be depressed. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Priscilla. This has been rich, and I guess I usually offer this and want to see if you're okay. If people get off the webinar tonight and they still have questions and things are popping up, is that okay if they forward their questions to continue this conversation?
I mean, I can put my email in the chat, or happy to be contacted through Heather. Also, I do hope you'll check out and learn about some of these incredible women on my website. It's just my name, PriscillaPope-Levison.com. It's not for selling books. It's really to help. I study the history of evangelism to remind us that we're standing on the shoulders of so many, many people. I said this, Matthew heard me say this today earlier, that we're not the first ones to pave this way. We're not the first ones to come up with whatever model. These have been tried and true, and it's helpful to me when I get discouraged that we're not alone, and we've got this great cloud of witnesses cheering us on.
Yes, well, thank you. I just, Wesley just submitted a final question about small groups. If you want to address that briefly.
That's a great question, Wesley. Hi, by the way. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. If I were orchestrating a small group, an evangelistic small group like this, I would not group similar people together. So I've been convicted by John Wesley, who purposefully wanted us to study the Bible with people who are vastly different from ourselves, and that's a way that we can come to hear others' perspectives and opinions. So I don't know, Wesley, I'd have to think about it. I'd love to hear what you think, whether you think that would be helpful to structure a small group so that there's similarities, or I don't know. My gut feeling is I wouldn't want to orchestrate it so intact. Sometimes it drives me nuts that our Sunday school, so our son is single at 25, and there's not a place for him in our church because it's all segmented by age or by marital status. So he's not a college student anymore, and he's not married, and so he doesn't fit anywhere. Well, come on. I mean, if a 25-year-old guy is going to show up at your church, who the heck cares? He should be able to join any place he wants. That's probably a terrible way to end this, but I fight against a lot of those structures, Wesley, because I would love to be paired with someone who's very different from me. I think that's a way that we can learn about each other. So let me leave it at that.
Well, thank you. Well, and Priscilla, that ties back to relationships and hospitality, right?
Yes.
Making room. So how are we making room for all? And so we're at our time. This has been wonderful. It went quickly. I want to give a quick shout out to Lynn, who's been joining us from New Zealand, which has been amazing.
Oh, Lynn, yes. Hi. Oh, that's on my bucket list because I'm a spinner, and there are more sheep in New Zealand than people.
But thank you. This has been wonderful. I want to remind you that we'll have another session next week. If you haven't registered, you can go on the Foundation website and register for that session as well. But Jeff Conklin Miller, who has been serving as the E. Stanley Jones Professor of Evangelism at Duke, will be presenting on his latest book next week. And I think Priscilla's going to share the screen again just one more time. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, would love for you to reach out to me. There's my email address. Would love to either forward a question on to Priscilla or point you to another resource that might be helpful. But again, want to say a special thanks to Priscilla. Thanks to Jason for running things
Thank you.
behind the scenes, and just pray God's blessings on each of you and your ministries and your families, and hope that you'll join us next week. And with that, I'll have Jason sign us back off.
All right, thank you very much. So great to see everyone on the webinar. As a reminder, this entire session was recorded, and we hope that you'll join us next week for our next webinar. So with that, we wish you a great rest of your day. Take care for now. Bye-bye.